Seymour, Lift Going Down or Up from Blue Dwarf. Written and recorded by David Ball. Original post written on March the 14th, 2011. I lost my smegging parents when I was a teenager, you peasant, Rosette yelled back, breathing heavily. I lost everything I'd ever known in one moment, she said, quietening down long enough to hide her face in her knees. Seymour looked at the bottle of wine in his hand, then at the crying woman. He edged closer and rubbed her on the shoulder nervously as she sobbed. He looked again at the bottle of wine and cringed as he dropped it to the floor and kneeled down to give Rosette a hug. There, he said, trying to ignore the sound of the wine roll across the floor and out of the gap in the lift where it fell into the flaming lift shaft below. So you had servants? He said, rubbing her back as she dug her face into his shoulder. He worried his straggly beard would annoy her, but she hadn't complained yet. And you had a big house? He just couldn't believe it. He pulled away from her. Why didn't you tell me? I thought you were a commoner. She laughed or sobbed, he couldn't tell which. We could have had dinner parties, he said. I could have invited the other ambassadors, and you could have invited your rich family. They're dead, you smegging idiot. Oh, yes, sorry about that. I was still getting over the shock of you not being a commoner. I forgot to listen to the rest. He waited for the sobbing to subside. So, what was your big house like? As big as Buckingham Palace? They burned it down, she said, wailing and crying more. Seymour had to hug her again. Oh dear, I'm so sorry, this isn't helping. Then he thought for a moment. Although this is taking my mind off my current misery, so it's not so bad. She stopped crying to smack him around the head, then continued. So, out of everyone you know, who would you least want to be stuck in a lift with? You, Rosette said. Oh, come on, I'm not that bad, Rosette sniffed. Not as bad as Pancake. I'd hate to see his stupid face right now, but you're almost as bad. Seymour grinned at that. Then he heard someone climbing up the lift shaft. He peered out of the hole to see Justin Pancake climbing up. Psst! What are you doing here? Seymour whispered. Saving you? Justin said. Smeg off! Seymour said, and Justin started to climb down. Seymour peered his head back in. Well, it looks like we won't be rescued any time soon. Then he crawled across the lift and sat down in the opposite corner and started twiddling with his beard. You know, I never used to want to be an ambassador, Seymour said. I never even wanted to be captain. He leaned his head back against the cold metal wall. Do you know what I wanted to be? Rosette continued crying and didn't answer. I wanted to be an antiques dealer, he said with a grin. Antiques Roadshow was my favourite television programme. Or a wine taster. I remember when I was young. 24 years ago. Young Seymour, 17 years old. Earth, England. West Yorkshire. In a grotty farmhouse between two lanes of the M62 motorway. Seymour hated his life. He especially hated this house. It was where he lived with his parents and both sets of grandparents. He looked out of the window of his tiny bedroom, which looked out over a small, grotty, muddy farmyard, and then an endless sea of motorway. Their house was built directly in the middle of two lanes of the busy M62. The Napley family had bought it cheap because of the constant mind-numbing sound of cars whizzing past and the constant pollution. Seymour walked out of his bedroom and into the living room. I'm bored, he announced. The living room was the main room of the house where the entire family congregated. His mother and father and brother were there playing a game of holographic Monopoly. Both sets of grandparents were all there too, all in one large bed, just like Charlie Bucket's family from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It was a nuisance having two sets of grandparents sleeping in the same room, because they got in the way of the TV. But there wasn't really anywhere better for them to go. The house was small, and they didn't have enough money to move. The Napley family were poor. They were so poor that Seymour wasn't allowed a brand new back-to-reality game like all his friends. That's why his family had to settle with the old-fashioned holographic Monopoly. They were so poor that Seymour had to share his bedroom with his kid brother. They were so poor that Seymour couldn't afford to go to town and socialise with other friends from school. which is why he was stuck at home on this rainy bank holiday. They were so poor that Seymour had begged his parents for some antique furniture to replace their cheap IKEA ones, but he was ignored. "When you get a job, maybe you can buy some antiques, but not until then," his father had told him. "I'm so bored," he announced again, as nobody seemed to hear the first time. His mother looked up. "Seymour, dear, try some of this wine I'm drinking. I think you're old enough now." Seymour screwed up his face. "No, mother. I've tasted that wine you've had before and it's horrible. It tastes like vinegar." "No, dear, this is good stuff. I won it in a raffle." Seymour took his very first sip of good wine and a smile grew across his face. "So what does it taste like?" asked his mother. "Wonderful," he said. "I didn't know wine could taste this good. Are there different flavours?" "Every type of wine is a bit different," said his mother. "Fantastic," said Seymour, realising that this would change his life forever. "I must try all the different types. Can you buy me some more, mother?" "Don't be silly, Seymour. We can't afford to buy the good stuff. Maybe if you got a job when you finished school, you'll be old enough to join the Space Corps next year." Seymour started to sulk. "But I don't want to join the Space Corps," he said. His grandad scoffed from the shared bed in the centre of the room. "A good wage the Space Corps does," he said. "You can buy us all a new house." "And a new bed," said his grandmother. "But I don't want to join the Space Corps," Seymour said. "I want to be an antiques dealer or a wine taster," he said, and reached for the bottle of wine, but his mum slapped his hand away. There was a knock at the door, and Seymour's mum opened it. "It's your Uncle Pete," she said, and greeted him. He was a tall man with bushy eyebrows. "He's not my uncle," Seymour said rudely. "He's just some man that Dad met in the pub." It was true, Pete Tenshall wasn't an uncle by blood, but he'd been around the family long enough to earn the name, although he did occasionally disappear for long periods of time and nobody really knew where he lived. "Fancy coming with me to London?" Uncle Pete asked Seymour. Seymour said nothing. "Go on, love, it'll be good for you," said his mum. Young Seymour crossed his arms. "Absolutely not," he argued. "Not with him. He might be a paedophile." Trapped in the broken lift, Seymour turned to Rosette. "Is this story boring you?" he asked. Rosette looked up and wiped her eyes. "Yes." Seymour continued anyway. "Seymour," snapped the child's father, "that's not a polite thing to say. Apologise at once to Uncle Pete." "Absolutely not," said Seymour. "Look at him. Look how bushy those eyebrows are. They are definite paedophile eyebrows." Seymour's dad whacked him with the latest newspaper, which really hurt, as it was an iPad. "Sorry, Pete, I'm just not sure what's got into the lad. He's just angry because we want him to get a job with the Space Corps." Seymour stomped his foot. "I want to be an antiques dealer," he shouted. His dad forced him to put on his coat and practically pushed him out of the door. "Don't worry, I'll take care of him. He'll enjoy a day out in London," said Pete Tenshall. They flew to London in Pete's ship. It was an old blue midget, one with the tracks and no legs. It was completely battered and looked like it could barely fly, but managed to get them to the capital city in just under an hour. They flew past Big Ben, which had recently been converted to digital. "This doesn't make sense," said young Seymour as they parked up and got out. "This is a Blue Midget Type 388. It's a brand new model that came out less than 6 months ago, but for some reason this one looks like it's 100 years old." Pete started to look uncomfortable. "You must be mistaken," he said. "It's just had some wear." "No ship that's only 6 months old can be that battered," said Seymour. "And what's this written on it?" "Please, come this way," Pete said, trying to distract him. "It's got some words written on it, but you've painted over them," said young Seymour. "It says dwarf, something dwarf." "It's not important," said Pete. B.L. Dwarf," said Seymour. "Was that the name of the ship you stole it from?" "I didn't steal it," said Pete. "Yes, you did," said Seymour. "Space Corps regulation states that if a Jupiter Mining Corporation vessel is to be sold as a civilian vessel, it needs to have a valid tax disc. And I didn't see one on your windscreen." "Oh, bollocks. OK, I stole it," he admitted. "Can you come with me now? I've got something I want to show you." Pete started pulling him towards a big crowd. "Also, there's something else peculiar about you," Seymour pointed out. Pete sighed. "What?" "That coat you're wearing. It only came on sale 6 months ago." "So?" "So I've seen you with my dad for years, but you've always been wearing that same coat." "What can I say? I'm a trendsetter." "No," young Seymour shook his head. "You're a time traveller." What? Said Pete, and pulled Seymour away from the crowd that he'd been leading him towards. Is it that obvious? Seymour tapped his foot. To a 17-year-old with a good imagination, yes. Pete breathed heavily through clenched teeth. This would have been easier if you just came with me and didn't ask any questions. I've got something to show you. What is it so important that you have to travel back in time to show me? The thing I want to show you is something that'll allow you to release your true potential. Potential? Yeah. You have this stupid idea that you want to be a wine taster, said Potential. Seymour looked up at him. Or an antiques dealer? Potential rolled his eyes. Yeah, but do you know how much impact on the universe you will have if you become either of those? Seymour shrugged his shoulders. None, said Potential. Absolutely none. You'll live and die, and nobody will care. But if you became an officer in the Space Corps, you'll do so much, much more. Seymour tilted his head in interest. How much more? Potential encouraged Seymour to stand up onto a parked car so he could see over the crowd. They were all waving flags and throwing streamers to celebrate the launch of the brand new Space Corps flagship, the SCS Ark Royal. The captain of the ship was dressed in a brilliant white uniform and saluted the crowd to a lot of cheering. They stood in front of the Ark Royal, a sleek spacecraft the size of an aircraft carrier, which was parked on the Mall near Buckingham Palace. Next to the captain stood the King of England and his pregnant wife. The king threw a bottle of champagne on the Ark Royal to christen it, and the ship rumbled and took off into the sky. Amazing, said Seymour. He said, and watched the ship fly into the clouds. Good old British engineering at its best. He put his hand on his heart and started singing God Save the King. Others in the crowd joined in, and suddenly there were thousands of people singing to the king and his pregnant queen. When it was finished, Seymour turned to the time traveller Potential, who he knew as Pete Tenshel. So, Uncle Pete, if you've seen the future, what happens to me? Do I become a magnificent Space Corps captain? Pete grinned. I don't want to give too much away. Please, said young Seymour. Potential nodded. If you try hard enough, you'll become captain, and more. He stared at the king and queen. Seymour followed the stare and turned quickly back to Potential. What, really? I'll be King of England? Potential simply grinned, then looked at his watch. We should be getting back, he said, and then flew back in the old blue midget. When back at the house between the motorways, Seymour bounced through the door shouting at his parents. I know what I'm going to do with my life. I'm going to join the Space Corps. I'm going into outer space. His parents looked at each other and grinned. Then they looked at Potential, who simply smiled and walked away, then disappeared. The Naplay family never saw Pete Tenshel ever again. Back in the broken lift shaft. So that's why I wanted to become captain, said Seymour. Because of some paedophile time traveller with rather large eyebrows. He sighed. If it wasn't for him, I'd never be in this mess now. He looked down at his dirty shoes. They used to be smart Armani, but were now scuffed and covered in crusted-on baked beans. If it weren't for him, I'd never have lost her, he said. Rosette put a hand on his arm. If it weren't for him, you'd never have had a daughter, she said. Think about that. Maybe it's for the best, Seymour said. Then she wouldn't be alone on that big empty spaceship for the rest of her life. I've sentenced her to a lifetime of misery. She's so young she'll probably forget who I even am. The tense moment was broken by the sound of scrabbling, and Justin Pancake crawled into the lift shaft. You're saved, he announced. Oh, not you, Rosette said, hanging her head in her hands. Will you please excuse us? I'm telling the story of how I ruined my life, Seymour said. Oh, yeah, I heard about that when I was climbing up, said Justin. You know a time traveller with bushy eyebrows called Potential? Me too. Oh, not Potential, you imbecile. Pete Tenshel. Oh, the wordplay dawned on him. Yeah, he's a twat that occasionally appears and convinces me to do twatty things, admitted Justin. And then I do them. Why do them then? Asked Rosette. Because I'm a twat, he admitted. Justin then turned on the control panel in the lift and started pulling out wires. Soon the lift shuddered and started moving upwards. Seymour laughed at his own story. So I've been living my entire life because one man told me what to do. He stood up. From now on, he announced, I'm going to live my own life. He felt his heart beating quickly as he got excited about this revelation which will change his life forever. And I'm going to do what I want to, not what someone else tells me. What are you going to do? Rosette asked him. Whatever I damn well like, he said. I'm going to be an antique stealer. He felt his heart pounding in his chest. Then he looked at Rosette, and before she could do anything, he grabbed her and pulled her close to his body. Then he pushed his bearded face onto hers and kissed her. With tongues. This podcast is a work of fiction and is in no way endorsed, approved, or even liked by the creators of Red Dwarf. For more stories and information, visit bluedwarf.co.uk.